I want to have a look and to sort of discuss the engine really. Not so much the engine of this particular car, the engine as a whole, as a design. Let's just pull the bonnet release. It's quite windy. We're down on the seafront and it's quite windy, so forgive me if you can't hear this very well. Now, and also the condition of this engine, well actually it's very original, so you can see it's almost complete. It's very, very dirty, it's very filthy. I'm not too worried about that at this stage. I will address that in the sort of coming months. I just really need to make the car stable at the moment. But this actual engine, it's the Jaguar XK engine, and it first went into production in 1948. So when this car was made in 1984, you know, it was approaching 40 years old as a production engine, which is absolutely remarkable. And it's extremely tough, it's extremely strong, and actually enormously powerful. You know, in its day, in the 1940s and 50s, this would have been an absolutely remarkable engine, and it's remarkable today. Even today, it's hugely powerful, very, very, very smooth. But it does have its problems, and those problems, lack of use is a big issue. What happens when these engines get left standing? If you don't use them often, all of the rubber seals in the valve gear, they shrink, they perish, and they crack. Particularly around the actual each cylinder's valves, the actual guides, and they burn oil at the most furious rate, and it smokes like hell. So there might actually be no engine wear whatsoever, but the thing will probably burn a gallon of oil in 100 miles. And unfortunately, you do have to remove the head to replace those rubber seals. So it might only cost £30, or maybe less than that, for a set of seals, but it is a cylinder head off job. And the other thing that happens, and when they don't get used very often, is right down at the bottom of the engine, the main crankshaft seals, they shrink and they crack. They're not so much the very early ones. The very early ones were rope, but the slightly later ones, you know, that were they were rubber, they shrink and crack, so you get enormous leaks coming from the crankshaft, and that is a complete engine out and stripped down job. A real nuisance. But as regards wear, these things are capable of extremely high mileages. They're capable of quite easily 200,000 miles or even more. You know, I've had them at much more than that. So well looked after. 250,000 is not unreasonable. Now, it went into production in 1948, and it was used in so many different models, from the XK120, the XK140, the XK150, the saloon cars, the Mark 7, the Mark 8, the Mark 9, the Mark 10, the 420G, the Mark 2, the Mark 1, an S-Type, a 420, what else? Yes, then in the XJ6 Series 1, 2 and 3, which is what this is. So it's a massive, I've probably missed something there. And I think I've even missed out the almighty C-Types and D-Types. They had this XK engine. And, you know, there were slightly different sizes, you know, the different size. This one's a 4.2, it's the largest. I think the C-Type and the D-Types were probably a 3.4. I could be wrong, it might be a 3.8, but it was basically the same engine, just in a different state of tune. And they were almighty things that were built, and in fact they won the Le Mans 24 hours. But it is a beautiful engine. But if it's well serviced and well maintained, they're really capable of going on for massive mileages. Overheating can be an issue. You know, there's a lot of hoses. If you get water leaks, of course it will overheat. And when they don't get run a lot, you get a lot of sludge builds up in the waterways. A problem that engines that have this is an aluminium head with a cast iron block, and you've got the gasket joining the two, so there's no direct contact between the head and the iron. You don't get electrolytic corrosion there, but you do get electrolytic corrosion appears in the waterways of the cylinder head, and then that's largely due to these bolts here are obviously steel, and they touch the cylinder head and they bolt into the bottom of the iron. So the electrolytic corrosion is conducted through through the head bolts, and where the waterways might supposed to be round, they end up long, or they corrode horribly, and that can be a real problem. And the only real way to avoid that is very, very regular changing and flushing of the water, of the coolant. And shouldn't really be water, the antifreeze. The antifreeze has anti-corrosion inhibitors in there, but those inhibitors do degrade over a year or two. So I'm strict. I change mine every year. Some people say, well, I've hardly driven the car, it's sat around for 3 or 4 years, I've only done a couple of hundred miles. But the antifreeze, it won't freeze the engine, but the corrosion inhibitors will have degraded and it will still corrode. So you get waterway corrosion. That's a real problem. And then another issue. This is on the later engines. On the earlier engines from the 40s and early 50s, the cylinder head studs were quite short, and then the later ones, they went much deeper. They were about 50% longer. They went much lower into the block, and we can't see it with all of this in the way. All of the I'm trying to see if I can see a core plug. I probably can't. Not really. No. So with all the ancillaries, now these head studs go right down into the bottom, and they actually sit at the bottom in the they sit in the water jacket. Let me just sip in the car. They sit behind the core plugs, and they actually permanently sit in the water jacket. If the coolant is fresh and it's got, the antifreeze is in good condition, the bolts won't corrode. But if you leave the car standing for some time, the corrosion inhibitors degrade, and it's probably about 2 inches. The bolt sits directly in the water. That section will corrode, and it becomes very thin, and it crumbles, and all of the rust particles end up flushing round in the coolant. But the actual shaft of the bolt, it ends up thin in the middle, and at that particular point they stretch under enormous tension with the engine being revved. They stretch. It's only a fraction of a millimetre, but it loosens it can loosen the head. Just that tiny little bit of stretch. Just a few fractions of millimetres. These things stretch low down, and the head can lift, and you obviously end up in failed gasket. This engine, it doesn't have a belt, a cam belt. It has a chain, which it goes down here, in like a U shape or a V shape. Now those chains can stretch, and this one's completely original. The engine's never been apart, and it hasn't stretched. You know if it's stretched because it rattles on the side of the casing down here. It sounds like a bell. It's dreadful. And you find that cars that have been revved very aggressively through the gears, they often have stretched chains, but they very, very rarely break, but they do stretch. And it can be changed. It's an awkward job, but it's not the end of the world. They can be changed, but like I say, it is quite a big job. It's not a job you'd want to do easily, but it's not the end of the world. But they very, very rarely break. But you'll know about it if it's stretched. It sounds like a bell. But it is just a remarkable engine, and it ran for so many years. This one is a later 4.2, and they have a huge amount of torque. So it works very well in the big saloon, mounted to an automatic gearbox. Phenomenal amount of torque, and they're so smooth and so unstressed. The smaller engines, like the 3.4s and the 3.8s, and even the 2.8, they rev much more vigorously. They're much freer revving, but they don't have the same level of torque. The smaller engines are much more suited to the manual gearbox. I have had a few 4.2s as manuals, and they're quite wonderful to drive. Totally different to this. Totally different. This is actually quite docile. You can use it beautifully around town. It's quite docile. It will, if you push it hard, it will move. It's very powerful, but it's not as vigorous and as raucous as the manual version. So to be honest, I do love both. Ideally, to have the same car with a manual and an automatic, it'd be perfect. But the bigger engine, realistically, probably suits the automatic gearbox, but it's just more suitable. It's more docile. It's more tractable to drive in town as an everyday car. But yeah, a truly remarkable engine, and I will be cleaning it up in the coming weeks and months. It's filthy, but it's nothing more than filthy, and I'll get the engine nice and clean. It'll look like the new parts for the modern LPG here. We'll get there.